G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to IL2 with Mags, and today we'll be taking a look at the Soviet Klement Voroshilov KV-1S heavy tank, recently added along with the Tiger to the first wave early access of the tank crew module for IL2. Now, as always, we have to start off with mentioning the map is not the tank crew map. It's in fact designed for aircraft, and the KV-1S is still under development at this time, with not all of its systems fully modelled yet. Early access is early access after all. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk some history and development. The KV-1's origins start in 1938 with a design requirement put forth by the Soviet military for a new heavy tank design. The military had been looking for a new heavy tank design built to what it perceived at the time to be modern battlefield standards since 1934. This requirement would produce three leading tank designs: the T-100 prototype heavy tank, a 58-ton multi-turreted tank design with an 800 horsepower engine, of which two prototypes would be built, the SMK, a 55-ton tank design, again with two turrets and an 850 horsepower engine, of which one prototype would be built, and the KV. These three prototype tank designs did see some combat for testing, specifically in the 1939 to 1940 Russo-Finnish War. The T-100's failings became rather clear rather fast, with the tank being too heavy for its engine power output, and the multi-turreted design being difficult to utilise in a combat situation, along with several mechanical issues. The SMK was tested in a similar fashion and found to have similar problems to the heavier T-100 design. The KV, however, stood out by far as the superior machine. The KV prototype was of similar size to the T-100, but featured a single turret. The overall weight was lower, 58 tons down to just 45 tons, with improved armour protection ranging from 70mm at the sides and rear, up to 90mm in some places at the front. Primary armament was settled on a 76mm ZIS-5 cannon, and while the engine power was lower than the T-100 at just 600 horsepower, overall the KV-1 had better ground performance both on and off-road. While the standout design by far, the KV was not, however, without its problems. Much like the German heavy tank designs, the KV-1 suffered mechanical issues relating to its driveline. However, despite these mechanical weaknesses, the need for tanks within the Soviet Union pushed the design into service. By the German commencement of Operation Barbarossa, a little over 600 KV-1s had been completed, and the virtues of the design became apparent as soon as it reached the front lines. Now, this is something that's important to take into account. While most people know of the Tiger and its infamous 88mm cannon, and the Panther and its heavy armour, the later Panzer IVs with their fantastic long-barreled 75mm guns, and of course the impressive towed anti-tank field guns the Germans had, it's important to realise that these were not the bulk of German tank or anti-tank forces, especially during the earlier stages of Barbarossa. Most of the Germans' armour in these early stages was made up of tanks like the Panzer III, with its 50mm gun, a gun that, at normal fighting ranges and conditions, had great difficulty penetrating the KV-1's armour. This led to most KV-1 losses due to combat in the early stages of Barbarossa, being the result of German ground crews turning Flak 88 guns intended for anti-aircraft operations against them, as they were one of the few weapons that could reliably damage the Soviet heavy, as the following report details. On September 18, 1941, our crew, composed of Tank Commander and Company Commander Lieutenant P.P. Ivanov, Gun Commander Senior Sergeant E.E. Ivanov, Mechanic Driver Senior Sergeant B. Meinvich, Loader Sergeant A. Zibin, moved out from Kupchino to complete our mission in the direction of Moskovskaya Slavianka Pushkin for cooperation with the 2nd Battalion and the 142nd Infantry Regiment. At between 1700 and 1800 hours, a messenger came from HQ to the commander with orders to enter the battle, and our four tanks, one from the 84th OTB, drove on the highway to Novaya village. In the middle of the highway, we turned left and drove into a village. I don't know what it was called. From the western part of the village, 200 to 250 metres away, a high-caliber gun opened fire on us, likely larger than 76mm. We were hit 3 to 4 times. The 4th or 5th shot hit the driver's viewport and knocked it through, cracked the driver's head open, and the shell ignited, first a red fire, then a bright white. I started opening the hatch. The tank commander was crawling towards me. I barely managed to open the hatch and jumped out of the 20 to 25 centimetre opening onto a roadside ditch. Smoke and vapour was coming out of our vehicle. This report details a KV-1 being knocked out by multiple hits of a battery of Flak 88 switched from anti-aircraft to anti-tank duty. The shell description is actually that of an anti-aircraft shell incinerating itself rather than detonating correctly. likely due to damage taken from the armour impact, as anti-aircraft shells are not designed to penetrate tank armour, and incorrect fusing, as most anti-aircraft shells are set to detonate at a particular altitude rather than on contact. The KV-1 was a success, to a point, but as I mentioned, it still had its problems. While faster than the original T-100 design, it was still slow by comparison to many German designs of the time. It also struggled to maintain pace with Soviet breakouts, and as such was often unavailable to support troops and other lighter tanks such as the T-34. Mechanical reliability was also a problem, and while it was well armoured, the commander had very limited vision outside of the tank, leading to poor situational awareness in combat. Improvements on the design were needed. And this brings us to the KV-1S, as seen here in IL-2 Tank Crew. The KV-1S was an attempt to address these problems. The basic KV-1 design was still used, however the armour was thinned to just 75mm on the upper front and 60mm on the sides and rear, with the turret armour reduced to just 82mm at its thickest point. It was reasoned that this armour would still be thick enough to deal with most common German anti-tank guns, while having the same vulnerability as the KV-1 to larger caliber anti-tank weapons. The turret profile was also lowered to save weight, lowering internal space, but it was fitted with the commander's cupola with vision blocks facing in all directions, much like the cupolas of most German tanks. This increased the commander's situational awareness in combat significantly, and with the lower weight, now down to just 43.3 tons, allowed for a much higher top speed, with the maximum on-road speed being pushed out to 45 km an hour, while the maximum off-road speed was around 24 km an hour on stable terrain. The problematic transmission was also changed in the design to a newer planetary transmission system that, coupled with the lower weight, solved many of the reliability problems noted in the KV-1's original design. Ultimately, however, the KV-1S was both a success and a failure. The new design met its requirements and was a marked improvement over the first KV-1. However, by the time the 1S was put into production and finally reached the front lines at the end of 1942, larger caliber anti-tank weapons had become more common in German units. The period of near invulnerability enjoyed by the first KV-1 had passed. Another weakness was the gun. The 1S still carried the same 76mm ZIS-5 as the KV-1, and while this gun was very effective in the early stages of combat, as the Germans brought in larger tanks with larger guns, there also came higher volumes of armour. The KV-1S found itself often in the same position as the Panzer IIIs had facing off against the KV-1, with a gun unable to defeat the target's armour under normal combat conditions. In this respect, the KV-1S was ultimately no more and arguably less effective than the T-34 1942 models of the time. The smaller, faster T-34s could manoeuvre and flank German units in ways that the 1S simply couldn't, and were also more effective in supporting troops in breakouts, a design goal that the 1S was intended for. In the end, the KV-1S only enjoyed a production run of 13 months, from July 1942 to August 1943, and while the KV line would continue, it would ultimately be replaced by the IS series of tanks as the main heavy tank of the Soviet Union. So how is the KV-1S in IL-2, you ask? Well, it's much like its own history. Against the Panzer III already in game, if driven correctly, it is pretty much immune to fire, but against the Tiger? Well, not so much. While I don't want to go into it too much in this video, as I have a whole video planned for it later in the week, balance in simulations such as IL-2 is at the mercy of the mission designer. The simulation provides the tools of play by simulating the vehicles as close to reality as possible, but the mission designer, more often than not a member of the community, sets the rules of the engagement. Should the mission designer take into account numbers and positioning, placing realistic restrictions on the map, and should the KV-1S driver keep tactics in mind and position themselves to flank Tiger players in numbers, there should be no reason for the KV-1S not to give as good as it gets on the battlefield. But again, more on that in a future video. As for the tank itself, it's pretty bloody well modelled. The driver's position is nice and clean, with the vision slot actually giving a surprising field of view for a tank if you get close. The gunner's internal view is limited to a small circle for the MG's iron sights, but he can turn out providing the turret isn't rotated to the left, which will block the hatch and prevent it. The gunner's and commander's position is interesting. You cannot use the cupola if your gun is active on the tank at the same time. This forces you to leave the gunner station uncontrolled on standby during navigation, only shifting to it once in combat. Also, if the gun is in play, the commander cannot turn out. The commander's hatch is on the other side of the turret to the gunner's seat, requiring the commander to cross the gun in order to access it. Generally, not a wise move in combat. The other thing I've noticed is the KV-1S is very prone to having its engine knocked out. The tank will still be quite able to fight, but on more than one drive out I've taken what at first I expected to be a glancing blow, only to have the engine fail and refuse to restart. But again, early access. Currently there is no way to recover or repair or knocked out tanks, so it will be interesting to see how those mechanics are added in the future. Anyways, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you very much for watching. As always, please check the video description down below for links to my social media pages such as Facebook and Twitter, and of course my Twitch channel, and give me a follow if you like. Also, if you would like to help support the channel directly, please consider donating to me on Patreon. I'm intending to increase the number of these historical focused videos on the channel, but doing so requires good quality research materials, which sadly are not cheap. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please remember to click that like button, and if you are new here, please subscribe if you would like to see more. And don't forget to hit that bell icon on the main channel page to make sure you get notified of all newly released videos here. YouTube's pretty bad at notifying my subscribers otherwise. Anyways, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time everybody, take care.